Welcome to Redirect, Immigration Law and Perspectives, a weekly dive into the world of immigration law and its human consequences. I'm your host, Stephen Robbins, joined this week by fellow immigration attorney Matt Cameron. He's on Twitter. I believe it's at Matt_Cam. That's C-A-M, Matt, with two T's, of course. The name, not the object. We are talking about some really super interesting topics, including you're going to start hearing more and more of this leading up to the election, which is this idea that Republicans, especially Trump, of course, want to keep you safe. And Democrats want murder and chaos in the street. Of course, if you know a Democrat in your life, you know that's definitely true. But they relate this specifically to the sanctuary city policy. ICE is going out of its way to highlight gruesome crimes and to blame sanctuary cities. And it turns out it's actually not true. And, you know, you might be listening on this show to a couple of crazy lefties. But the truth is, even if you have a sort of national security first, enforcement first perspective, the policies of this administration are just sort of objectively making us less safe. If that's sort of the perspective that you want to take, it's just a fact. So people need to know the truth. And as I mentioned later, we are gearing up for Thanksgiving, and you got to be armed and ready for your MAGA relatives. So I think this is a good episode to listen to and know how to sort of engage on this particular issue. If you like this show, which, I mean, obviously, right? You can subscribe on iTunes and become a patron at patreon.com/redirect. Patreon is a website where you give money to people who do cool content. And we're all about that hashtag content on this show. So send us some money. We really appreciate it. For every 100 patrons, we take a pro bono asylum case from the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. And so it's a convenient way to help provide representation for people who need it. Folks, enjoy the conversation with Matt Cameron. Matt.
Yes.
Thanks for agreeing to do this. I gave you plenty of notice so that we could prepare.
Hours.
And literally hours.
Actual hours.
I wanted to first start by addressing something kind of important, some housekeeping. We have a producer on this show, Jeremiah Britt, at Jeremiah Britt on Twitter, except for he's currently been grounded. And as you know, you have a business, right? And if one of your employees were to do something in a public and shameful way, it would reflect poorly on you, and you might even feel inclined to address that. And so Jeremiah was recently suspended from Twitter. He did something that is frankly really disturbing and upsetting. Twitter has rules, right? Twitter rules.
Allegedly.
One of the rules is that you are not allowed to promote or encourage suicide or self-harm. And, you know, obviously with kids on the internet or people who might be in a vulnerable state of mind, to be telling people to hurt themselves is, you don't want that in a society. You
might be aware you could be convicted of manslaughter in Massachusetts for that. I don't know if you heard about that.
I hadn't heard about that, but I'll pretend like I knew that. And totally.
It's a very famous case. There's a documentary on Netflix about it. I can't remember the name of it, but yeah, can't just go telling people to kill themselves.
Right. I think I heard about that. They kind of like fell in love online, and the guy was like, yeah, you should. So anyways, Jeremiah, just so people know what I'm talking about, he tweeted at real Donald Trump, "Go fist yourself to the elbow, you festering clot of stupidity." And, you know, It's just not right to be encouraging somebody. Now, he's the president. Is he likely to fist himself to the elbow? It's hard to say.
Would that kill him? I don't think that would kill him. I mean, it's physically impossible, but...
Is it?
I'm sure that's, especially for Trump, I think that's physically impossible, but it's an open question as to whether he's inviting you to kill yourself if you're inviting you to do that.
The rule is against promoting or encouraging suicide or self-harm.
I think some people do that for fun.
Now, look, we're also not here to kink shame. So
no, never.
For the pro-fisting community, we want to apologize if it's coming across that way. But, you know, we totally discourage that. We want everyone to know, especially Twitter, that, you know, we agree with your decision. And if you let him back on to your website, keep an eye on him, because, you know, people like this usually don't just do it once, if you know what I mean.
I mean, the president can go himself, just maybe another way.
Okay. Right. Okay.
You can keep that or not. It's up to you.
Right. I just wanted to address that. So.
All right.
Now, people like to come to me and they say, how do you prepare such a great show? And, well, one way is by setting up a Google alert. I get stories sent to my email about immigration. One story came up about a man in Hermosillo, Mexico, who fell into a sinkhole, and he was swept away by underground water currents and stuck in some sort of pipe. It got me thinking about how I want to die, and I'd never thought of sinkhole. Where do you stand on A, how you want to die, and B, disappearing? And they're looking for him, right? I mean, maybe he's still alive, fingers crossed.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I can certainly relate to falling into a hole and being trapped in an endless current. I feel like we're...
Metaphorically.
Yeah, I've never tried it for real, but that's not how I want to die. I do have a terrifying fear of being trapped underground, specifically.
Ooh, yeah. So you're going to want to watch out for sinkholes because the pictures are...
Yeah, I'm just looking now. This is horrific.
Straight from your nightmare.
Yeah. Shout
out to sinkholes, but, there's a story. I don't know why they thought it was about immigration, but...
The word Mexico appears in here. I guess that's enough these days.
I guess what happened is the Phoenix Fire Department are down there lending their technical expertise. I guess they know a lot about sinkholes. So shout out to the Phoenix Fire Department. Matt, you wanted to talk about friend of the show, Kenneth Ken Cuccinelli.
When do I not want to talk about the Cooch?
For the record, and let the record reflect my deep admiration and respect for the acting head of USCIS. I hope that all my cases get approved. And, anything that's deemed to be negative should be tightly associated with your name.
I think we're all going to get requests for evidence anyway. I don't think there's anything we can do to stop it. So
that's true.
I'm going to lean in here. Do what you want.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about how badly he wants to be the head of DHS and why.
For those of us who follow his Twitter, right, that's all he's been doing. He's been tweeting about everything but citizenship and immigration services, which is putatively his job on paper. He's supposed to be running that.
Right.
He put out a press release. Did you see this press release? It's really something. Outlines all the ways that he is helping to meet Donald Trump's goals, and it specifically says that in the headline. Mm-hmm. One of those ways is he's bragging about the number of cases that have received requests for evidence. It just seems like a really strange thing to brag about, that we're slowing down these cases as much as possible.
Right. For the folks at home, tell them about what a request for evidence or an RFE is.
It's pretty much what it sounds like on the tin. Immigration can come back and just allege, sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not, that some piece of the case is missing. I don't know about you, but I've had the experience of having them say that dozens of pages that I did file weren't in the file.
Right.
So I refile them, or I have to point out they're already there. My favorite RFE of all time, maybe I've even already told this story, but I got an RFE which actually asked me to prove that a petitioner who was born in Boston, and I provided a birth certificate for a Boston hospital, was a U.S. citizen. So I actually responded with a map of the United States, and I circled Massachusetts. I wrote in the cover letter that Massachusetts remained as one of the 50 United States, and it was approved within 24 hours. So,
just the sassiest.
Yeah, that's the dumbest RFE I've ever seen. But they can be from that all the way to, we do a lot of musician visas. I don't know if you've ever done those, but They're getting really strict on the talent visas right now. So they'll come back. We had one literally, we see the pictures, we see the roster, like this person has appeared in all of these major venues, including Madison Square Garden, on stage with famous artists, but looks like, they're just in the violin section, right? So you have to prove that they're actually somehow, I know, like, of course they're in the violin section. They're a violinist, right? You don't have to be the world's leading violinist. You just have to be in the top 5% of violinists, which you definitely are if you're touring and appearing in Madison Square Garden, right? So that kind of thing.
Oh, man. So what you're saying is things suck right now, even in parts of the law that I'm not familiar with at all? Is that what you're...
Oh, yeah. Every part of it. And the Cooch is all there. He's bragging about it. Again, his job is supposed to be to run the part of the agency, the part of DHS that handles all these things, what we'd call legal immigration. But instead, he's touring the border, he's talking to CBP, he's talking to ICE, he's talking about criminal aliens, he's talking about asylum fraud, and asylum is part of the job, but it's a very different approach to USCIS director. Nobody's tried it quite this way before. And it's pretty obvious the whole time he's been auditioning for DHS secretary. I mean, you've seen it, the tweets, right?
Right.
It's just all over. And nobody thought to stop and check to see if maybe he could actually be appointed DHS secretary. And the joke this week is that he can't be done.
Sad trombone, maybe for our producer, who we strongly condemn. But maybe after that little bit of news, we drop in a sad trombone.
Yeah, poor guy. It's all I ever wanted.
It's really sad for him. Talking about RFEs, I mean, first of all, we did get one of these. I think we talked about this in the show a few weeks ago. One of these cases that they just denied outright, even though the evidence that they say isn't in the packet is in the packet.
Sure.
So that's a problem because the client is left with, you can either refile. If I do the work for free, which I would because I'm a nice guy, they're still going to be spending $2,000 in government fees in this particular case. Or we can sue, which is a whole other bag of tricks.
Right. And actually requires you to do some work.
Yeah, exactly. So that's always fun. We also recently saw this lady, she's actually already in withholding only proceedings, but another attorney had helped her with a U visa and it got denied. And so they issued a notice to appear for her adolescent child. And so that's another change, basically, that Ken Cuccinelli has helped usher in, which is to take applicants for benefits who are denied and refer them to ICE
to
be deported, which is a sensitive area.
Well, there aren't enough people in immigration court. That's really the problem.
Right.
They got to make sure that they keep those courts busy.
Right. And the RFEs, we've been getting a lot of just sort of, please write a paragraph explaining what you mean about this thing that will definitely be addressed in the interview anyways, that sort of thing, which is fun.
Yeah.
But there was another cool thing that Ken Cuccinelli did, which I wanted to mention. Like you said, they're issuing a lot of RFEs. They're super backlogged, right? Things are slowing way down, but they find time to get the really important stuff done. For example, changing the word foreign national to alien.
Very important.
In their manual.
Because a national still sounds like a person. You don't want to make it sound like a person. That's really the goal here.
Right.
And my favorite scoop, I actually have a pending FOIA on this because I know it's true because I've seen it, but I don't have proof. But they went through and removed the courtesy language a couple of years ago, right after Trump came in. I don't think this was a Cooch development, but literally things like, thank you for applying, and we regret to inform you that we have to deny your application, right? Stuff that's just like basic. I mean, you just paid, like you said, you just paid $2,000 in filing fees. Maybe we can say we regret to inform you, right, that you just wasted $2,000.
Right.
But there was a directive to actually remove all of that from the standard templates that UCIS uses. This is the kind of stuff they're thinking about, is like, how can we make this harder? How can we make this less of a customer service facing organization? How can we make everybody feel like they're not being taken care of? Like, that's really what they're trying to do. They're trying to get away from the customer service mentality. They said that pretty specifically,
right?
Which is bizarre because this is a customer service agency that's paid for by filing fees. So the least you can do is say please and thank you, right?
You would think so, but
you would think.
This is all about owning the libs. And a couple of weeks ago, Matthew and I talked about Ken Cuccinelli posting a picture of his plastic straw.
Yes.
Again, doing the important work.
Yep.
And the plastic straw thing is nobody really cares. And if you do, you might have some dietary issues to work out, I think. That might sound judgmental, but you can get by without a straw.
Yeah, I saw that tweet and I did not feel owned. Did not work. Completely unowned.
No, it was the opposite for me. I was totally thoroughly owned. And this whole thing, so the policy manual, just the first line, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, makes decisions on benefits and service requests that not only affect aliens and their future, but also the well-being of U.S. citizens, families, organizations. So that used to say foreign nationals.
Right.
And they basically, went through and replaced it. Again, this is totally in the vein of just, some people don't like this word. Well, check out how triggered you're going to be now.
Well, let's use hundreds of hours of federal employee resources to make sure we change every instance of this word. That's very important.
Let's change the name of the agency to the Alien, whatever, I don't know. Alien Support Program thing.
Well, did you see the ad they posted for people who want to be asylum officers? And this is actually, to me, this really tells the story. Help safeguard the immigration system. That's how they're selling asylum officers. Which,
right.
My comment there was, it's like saying, that a doctor's primary job is to look out for a hospital's bottom line. It's just not what a doctor does, right?
Well, not in most countries.
Not in most places. I guess maybe a little more so here. But your responsibility is supposed to be to the patient. And as an asylum officer, your responsibility is to fully and fairly adjudicate a claim and maybe protect somebody from persecution in their home country. But no, according to the Cooch, you're helping to safeguard the immigration system. And I just think that's such a terrible way to frame it. It's really sad.
Their job is to spot fraud.
Yeah.
And by the way, footnote, all cases are fraudulent. I think that's the current position of USCIS. Yeah.
Well, it's that barbarians at the gates mentality, right? That they're just trying to tear down our gates and our walls and we have to protect them. And I always like to talk about this, but the immigration system originally was part of the Treasury Department because we recognize that aliens are good for business. They bring us money. And then they were part of labor because we recognize they're good workers. And then they were part of the Department of Justice because we started to see them as a criminal thing. And now they're Homeland Security because we see them all as terrorists. It's a very natural evolution through American history here. And now it's all about protecting the immigration system and protecting U.S. citizens. And I just think it's really sad. It's just especially sad. I mean, we can joke about all this stuff, and we should, because it's pretty funny. But at the end of the day, he's politicizing USCIS to a degree that this agency has never been politicized before. It's always been kind of a safe, maybe I'm looking at this a little too rosily, but I've always seen USCIS as an apolitical benefits agency that just processes the things and goes home. And You got this guy out there just making it another branch of Trump's government and talking about how they're accomplishing Trump's goals. And it's really sad.
Yeah, it would be hard, I think, especially if you were an asylum officer and you probably went into that job because you maybe care about foreign policy or issues of international law, and that's maybe your personal interests in helping people who are fleeing persecution.
Yeah.
And now you're just getting, I'm sure, like all these directives from your higher up saying, no, actually, what your job is to be a pseudo ICE officer.
Mm-hmm.
And to be clear, like an asylum officer's job always included issue spotting for fraud. Like, of course, that's...
And credibility. I mean, there's nothing wrong with assessing somebody's credibility when they're in front of you. That's part of the job.
Of course. But it's almost been flipped on its head. So, and in fact, you pointed out this story that you got into a little spat.
Mm-hmm.
The head of the asylum officer union, I guess.
Yeah.
They had a meeting and it was a little bit awkward.
Yeah. A tense exchange, as it was described.
Cuccinelli said, maybe another day, but it's hard to meet with people who are suing you. Even though they're not suing USCIS, they filed amicus briefs supporting several lawsuits over USCIS policies.
Which directly affect USCIS workers and asylum officers that they want to have a voice in this. But no, that's suing them, apparently.
Right. So, Cuccinelli, good guy.
Yeah, not really, actually.
Actually, I think he's great, and I think he's doing a good job, and I think all my green card applications should be approved.
Yes, they should.
Now, I wanted to talk to you about our friends over at ICE, who I also am a big fan of, across the board, right? A few exceptions. I saw this tweet the other day from this guy, Joshua Freed, at Freed for Gov, and he's running for governor here in Washington. And he said, you can be pro-immigration and anti-sanctuary state. Jay Inslee's enactment of signing a law to make Washington a sanctuary state is having deadly impacts and has not only made our communities less safe, but actually more dangerous.
Okay, and he's got plenty of data to support that, obviously.
Plenty of data. He cites this article from Law Enforcement Today. I actually decided to look it up on the Seattle Times, but there was a guy who they're alleging is undocumented from El Salvador, a member of the MS-13 gang, who is being charged with a pretty brutal murder here in Washington State. And you might not have heard of this story because while it's tragic, murders happen and don't get a lot of national attention, but ICE and Border Patrol specifically have really gone out of their way to try and highlight this case as an example of how we're less safe because of the sanctuary city policies in the state of Washington. So essentially, this guy was accused of murder. It sounds like he probably did it. Just take off my lawyer hat for a minute and just say, sounds guilty.
Yeah.
He was apparently in jail earlier on some, lesser charges. But because the local jail no longer holds people indefinitely so that ICE can get around to coming and picking them up, he did his time or paid his bail for whatever the charge was. They don't even say. And he was released into the community. Now, why is that not really the local law enforcement's problem?
There's a lot we need to talk about here. I think this is actually a really good example because it's such a brutal outlier, right? I mean, this is a really brutal murder, right? Just looking at the details.
Yeah.
It is gang related. It sounds like the kid was a gang member. And we have the same problems here in Boston with MS-13. But they're freakish. It doesn't happen very often. But I think a lot of people might be listening to this and wondering, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with ICE coming in and getting a guy that we know is dangerous, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really important conversation to have. And I was just thinking about it a lot today because there is a pretty good law and order argument to be made about why ICE shouldn't work with the police. And I think it's good to look at it from the other side. To have Mr. Freed saying straight up that we're safer if ICE is working with the police, I don't see how I can say that when at least here in my immigrant community, people would not work with the police at all if they thought there was any chance that they'd end up in immigration. They wouldn't go report anything. I mean, the police have a lot of work to do. BPD is not great, but they at least have made it very clear to the community that you're not going to ever have any immigration problems if you come talk to us. And that changes everything, knowing that, right? And so how much crime, how many violent, dangerous people have we been able to bring to justice because immigrants are willing to work with the police? And again, we can set aside how we feel about the police, how we feel about the justice system, everything else. I'm just saying, if you're looking at it from the law and order side of things, there's a lot of benefit to sort of carving out this safe haven so people can actually feel like they can work with the justice system.
Right.
And I think it's extremely short-sighted to say, look at this terrible person who did this terrible thing who shouldn't have been here, who could have been stopped. And I don't think either of us is saying it's not a terrible thing, but this is not the answer.
Right. So you're talking about cooperation in terms of victims and things like that. But there might also be somebody, for example, who needs to serve a day or two on a suspended license. Mm-hmm. They're maybe not a dangerous person at all.
Right.
And it's just they had some tickets, they forgot to pay or they couldn't pay. Now they've got to go do 24 hours or whatever the sentence might be. If that person thinks that there's a chance they're going to be held even longer than that, and in fact held for the purpose of having them ultimately deported, they're less likely to comply with really basic requests from the criminal justice system.
Sure.
The other thing that strikes me about this case is just because the local jail isn't going to hold somebody indefinitely doesn't mean that ICE couldn't have picked him up or found out where he lived and when he was going to be released, and that they couldn't have been there when he was being released by the jail.
Yeah.
And the issue, I think, honestly, has to do with allocation of resources. So I'll just give you a few examples. We have a client who entered seeking asylum, I think in 2013. And we almost immediately got her proceedings administratively closed as she qualified for a U visa. So we filed the U visa and she's now in deferred action status. So she's got her work permit. She's never had to do any kind of check-ins with ICE. And she just got a letter from the local ICE office asking her to check in. And she has no criminal history. She's been here now for 6 years or so. She has a work permit. She's expressly allowed to be in the country now.
And they haven't recalended her for proceedings?
No, they haven't.
Right.
Proceedings are still administratively closed, and they've decided that this is a way that they're going to use their resources. So this is an officer now who has to meet with her. They had to, type up and mail the letter and all these things. And who knows what they want to do, why they're even scheduling this thing. We had another similar case recently of a lady. She's been here most of her life. She does have a prior order, but she has a pending U visa, and she's been checking in now for like 5 years, and they decided to detain her suddenly without giving her the option of like making travel arrangements on her own or any of that. When you look at how they're expending their resources, and if you go in on an average day to your local ICE office, you're going to see a long line of regular non-criminal aliens.
For sure.
Who are just there checking in. And to see that agency complaining that like they didn't have the resources to pick up somebody who they thought was, a dangerous criminal.
Totally.
It's absurd. How about instead of having these people do their regular routine check-ins where they just show up and you sign the paper, why don't you send a guy down to the local jail to pick up this guy when he's released? Or as the sheriff's office says in this piece from the Seattle Times, so the King County executive, Dow Constantine, pushed back against what he described as ICE's public relations offensive. He says ICE is fully aware that if they present a valid criminal warrant issued by a U.S. District Court judge or magistrate, the county would comply. So that's the other thing that they could always do.
An actual criminal warrant, yes.
Yeah. And
what a concept.
Yeah, what a concept, right? This is absurd. If you're concerned about the role of ICE in terms of like keeping your community safe, you should really be asking why the Obama priorities from 2014 were rolled back and why ICE is spending so much of their time deporting people with very minimal or no criminal history whatsoever.
Yeah.
It
went straight from an easily tiered set of priorities that I think anybody could understand to open season, right? Just straight up everybody in front of them. They have to grab them and they have to treat them all the same. It's been really hard to see that all happen. There are a couple of other angles to this too that I think are really important. And one of them is that these people talk about law and order and how we have to respect the rule of law and how it's our job to do that. But they're deporting these people in the middle of murder cases, in the middle of rape cases, in the middle of really serious things where they could be brought to justice and actually serve time. And instead, they're getting a free pass, basically. And I'm looking at this, again, from all angles, from the prosecution side. We already talked about it as a defendant. We talked about it as a victim. And I think that regular taxpayers might be surprised to learn that we're deporting people in the middle of murder cases.
Right.
That's kind of a problem.
There's this letter from Ralph
Gantz, our Chief Justice here in the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. Good guy.
So he writes this letter saying, hey, look, you guys are picking up these people. And we see this all the time. Somebody's in the middle of a DUI case, but here in this letter that the judge writes, he cites murder cases, rape cases, where the person might be out on bond or even detained, I guess, and they're being transferred to immigration custody and deported. I guess they wouldn't go from criminal custody probably directly to immigration custody, right? I mean, if the case...
Not unless they're released, yeah.
Yeah. So somebody might be out and they've got a court coming up for a rape charge or something like that. And ICE is literally helping them escape the country.
Yeah.
By deporting them. And then you're having victims and families who are sitting there going, so this case just remains open and the guy's a fugitive. Maybe he's deported to, wherever. And he doesn't have to go to jail or do any time for the crime that he may or may not have committed.
Or better yet, if we're deporting him to Cuba or Venezuela or something like that, he's never going to be extradited, right? We'll never get him back.
Right.
So you get to know that the guy who killed your sister or whatever is still out there having a nice life, enjoying himself. I know that we both have problems with the criminal justice system. I am very much an abolitionist in almost everything. But, these serious cases, justice should be done. Something should happen. You can't just let people get away with it.
Right.
It's really hard to see.
Yeah. And the flip side of that is, we've had clients detained and maybe they've got a pending charge and we know they might be deported because they're picked up like in this situation we're describing, but they've got a way to come back, maybe through a family member or something. But
right.
Now they've got a warrant because the criminal court thinks they're just not showing up for court when in fact they're in federal custody.
Yep.
And if they're deported before the case is resolved, that's going to throw a real wrench into the process of coming back. Obviously, a pending murder or rape charge would really do that. But even something simple like driving without a license or a DUI.
Petty theft or whatever. I mean, it could be anything.
Just something pending. When you go to the consulate to make your way back through a family petition or something along those lines, they're going to run your fingerprints and say, well, what's up with this warrant? We had somebody with a warrant for an unpaid ticket from years before. And he was allowed to come back through the consulate, but they spent an extra 4 or 5 months pulling the file and requesting records and that sort of thing.
Sure.
It's bad for the people who committed the crime. And even for the people who didn't commit the crime, it's not great. I'm with you. I don't like making the law and order argument personally. On the other hand, like I say sometimes, 9/11 is a thing that did happen. And there are some things that you can do to make sure that criminals or people who break the rules or who want to break the rules are held accountable. And if that's your primary concern, you should be really, really worried about our current set of policies.
For sure. Sure.
Things along those lines have not gotten better. They've only gotten worse.
This is something every Trump voter should know. And that's why I think it's important to get it out there, because it's always being put out there as open borders, as sanctuary cities, as if we live to protect criminals. That's what we're here for, right? That's what we wake up every day to do.
Right.
There's just so much more to it. And it's very frustrating because I think that these arguments really could be understood by the right people if they were getting out there. But the only winners in this whole scenario are ICE, because they get to say they deported a criminal alien, right? But due process loses, the state courts lose, state prosecutors, state police, families of victims, the victims, everybody loses. Defendant loses too, at the end of the day, like you're saying, with the right to have his due process. I mean, on the off chance you're actually innocent, then there you go. You got that warrant forever for something you didn't do.
Right.
So it's just all kinds of problems all around.
I think the best way to describe it, because we're coming up on Thanksgiving, so we got to start giving some Thanksgiving MAGA family tips.
Should do a whole show of those.
The best way to think of it, I think, is you imagine your local police department, right? And imagine a police department that said, look, there's a lot of laws on the books. We're going to try and focus our resources on the murders and the rapes. We're going to allocate the most resources to that. And maybe you have a big driving under the influence problem in your community. We're going to have some patrols. We're going to do some things like that. And then you have a candidate for police chief who says, you know what? We've been ignoring the jaywalking laws.
Yep.
People are just getting away with jaywalking. And it's bullshit. We're going to do something about it, and gets elected. And they decide that they're going to take those resources let's say there's 100 officers. They're going to just equally divide them amongst the statute. So every possible law you could break gets an officer. And suddenly you've got one detective on 50 murders and one detective on jaywalking, just handing out tickets like they're hotcakes.
Sure.
You would find that to be pretty absurd and not a good use of resources.
It's just not how things work, and it's just not realistic. I mean, it's priorities, right? And I think that a lot of people just understand that law enforcement can't enforce every law all of the time. And in fact, we don't want to live in a country where you do. That's just not a place I want to be, where they go after everybody for everything all of the time. But even if we could, we can't. We just can't do that. So we have to decide, and police officers make these decisions on the ground all the time. You can imagine state trooper at the side of the road, and a guy goes by and you realize he probably doesn't have a license when you run his plates. And then somebody else speeds right by who's going 300 miles an hour and he's drunk. I mean, you're going to go after that guy, right? Every time. You have to chase down the drunk driver. And it's just like you're saying, we're going to treat all these people the same as if an unlicensed operator is the same as a drunk driver. And this is the world we live in now. But the real thing with all of this is to make sure that we associate the word criminal and the word alien. So he can keep using the phrase criminal alien over and over again in public. And you keep seeing these horrific stories of gang members, of people doing terrible things, which again are freak outliers. There's a reason you hear about them when they happen, because they don't happen very often.
Right.
And the Kate Steinle thing, that was the worst they could come up with. Again, terrible thing, shouldn't have happened, but it was an accident. And that's their banner. That's their rallying cry, is Kate Steinle, right? And that was the worst thing they could find that a criminal alien did. And again, of course, it's a pretty young white blonde lady, and that was the real reason they used her. But I think it says a lot that case wasn't a cold-blooded murder.
Right. Right. I think about that a lot too. Like, that was one of the first things he announced at his first State of the Union, that they were going to come up with that.
Kate's Law.
Well, yeah, but the hotline for report.
Oh, right. Yeah. The voice.
That's right.
Yeah.
So in other words, there's a real political will to highlight those things, and they've got the sort of infrastructure to do so with Fox News and everything like that. So if MS-13 really was like taking over towns
right.
and all this sort of thing, you would definitely be hearing about it.
I live in one of those areas. I mean, we live in the Central American area of Boston, and we are not under siege from MS-13.
Well,
happy to report.
Not what I heard. So anyways, well, Matt, I gotta go. I got a couple interviews, and hopefully I don't get RFE'd. So
good luck to you. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for coming on, and we'll talk to you soon.
Anytime. Later.
Bye.